Dan Mason versus Pavel Ivanchuk. Pavel Ivanchuk. When Paul says he came not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, 1 Corinthians 2:4-5. That power is not abstract force or charisma. It is the life of God himself, active in and through those who share his nature. Dan Mason. Hold on, Pavel. You've already gone beyond what Paul said. Paul never claimed believers share God's nature in the sense of essence or being. That's eisegesis, reading your idea into his words. Paul's point was about rejecting clever rhetoric so that faith rested on God's Spirit, not man's performance. Pavel Ivanchuk. Scripture ties this to participation, 2 Peter 1:3-4, where we become partakers of the divine nature. Dan Mason. You're twisting Peter here. Peter isn't saying we share God's substance. He's talking about escaping worldly corruption and living holy lives. Partakers of the divine nature is about moral transformation, not becoming little gods. That's a category error, Pavel. You've confused ethics with ontology. Pavel Ivanchuk. James 3:13 says wisdom from above is not merely intellectual, but pure, peaceable, and fruitful. Dan Mason. And what does that have to do with Paul's demonstration of spirit and power? James is addressing behavior and humility, not power or divine participation. This is proof texting, pulling a verse out of context because it sounds like it fits when it doesn't. Pavel Ivanchuk. John 15:5 shows that apart from Christ, we can do nothing. Dan Mason. Agreed, but dependence on Christ doesn't equal sharing God's nature. That's a false equivalence. Dependence is relationship, not essence. Jesus was teaching about abiding, not about believers merging with the divine. Pavel Ivanchuk. The sequence is important. God is the source. We partake of his nature, we walk in his wisdom, and power flows as his life overflows in us. Dan Mason. Nice sequence, but it's man-made. Paul didn't outline that. You've created a formula that makes God's power sound like a system we can activate. That's closer to mysticism than Scripture. In reality, God's power isn't a flowchart. It's his sovereign spirit working as he chooses. Pavel Ivanchuk. That's why Paul could reject clever rhetoric without rejecting truth or reason, because the authority of his message didn't rest on human skill, but on God's life being manifest. Dan Mason. No, Pavel. Paul rejected rhetoric so faith would rest in God's Spirit, not in him. You're trying to make Paul sound like a mystic philosopher teaching divine participation, when his whole point was about humility and dependence. Dan Mason's closing statement. Pavel. Your essay falls apart because it commits three major errors. 1. Eisegesis, reading mysticism into Paul's words. 2. Cherry-picking, dragging unrelated verses like James 3 and John 15 into the mix. 3. False equivalence, confusing moral transformation and dependence with sharing God's nature. Paul wasn't teaching divine participation. He was stripping away human pride so the Spirit's power would be clear. Please like, comment, share, and support this channel to learn more.